The valley was a bowl of white noise and death. Wind knifed down from the ridgelines, flinging dry snow in sheets that blurred edges and erased distance. The sky was a flat, overexposed gray, making the ground and horizon melt together. It felt like the world had been painted in only two colors, blinding white and the black of rock and gunfire. The armored vehicle sat canted in the center of the valley floor, its tracks half-buried, engines still idling in a ragged, choking roar. Its hull was scarred and pitted, one side panel peeled open like a can from something that had hit too close. The vehicle was the only real cover in the open, and every surviving member of the patrol clung to it like shipwrecked survivors hanging onto driftwood. Rounds cracked overhead, supersonic snaps that ripped the air apart. They came from the high rocky outcrops above, from nests dug into the jagged ribs of stone that lined the valley walls. Tracer lines stitched through the blowing snow, bright orange and green arcs, drawing the geometry of the kill zone in the sky. "Get that gun back in the fight," the patrol leader roared, voice raw from shouting. His name tape was half-ripped, his helmet spattered with mud and melting ice. He slammed his fist on the side of the armored hull. "Bravo, team. I need covering fire now. Now!" The only answer from his radio was a hiss, a smear of static. He slapped the handset against his plate carrier, as if he could jar it back to life, then tried again, shouting into the mic, "Steel 2. This is Frost 1. We are—" Hiss. Whine. Nothing. Above them, a machine gun carved another line of light inches over the hull, bullets smacking into the snow beyond with dull, heavy thuds. One round ricocheted off the roof with a metallic scream, showering everyone with sparks and fragments of paint. "Radios are fried," someone yelled from the other side of the vehicle. "It's like the net's drowned." It wasn't just the squad net. The long-range set in the back of the armored vehicle, their lifeline to higher command, to artillery, to rescue, spat the same white noise. Full-spectrum jamming, thick and smothering. Whoever had them in the crosshairs had done their homework. A mortar round screamed down and hit somewhere behind them with a concussive thump that shoved a wave of air across the valley. Snow and dirt fountained up, bits of rock pinging off helmets. The next round landed closer. You could hear the pattern in it, the precision, not random, not wild. Someone up there was walking the rounds in with professional patience. A supply sled, hit by a near miss, bucked sideways and flipped. Crates tumbled out and slid across the ice. One of the soldiers who'd been using it as partial cover was thrown clear, spinning through the air like a rag doll before hitting the ground hard and rolling. He came to rest on his back in the open, half buried in powder, one leg twisted at an angle that had no business existing. A bright bloom of red spread across the pristine white around him, too vivid in the washed-out world. He tried to move and screamed, the sound thin and ripped away by the wind and the crack of machine guns. "Man down! We got man down out there!" A voice called from behind the vehicle. "We can't get to him!" another shouted. Every move they made out of the narrow envelope of cover drew fire from three directions. The first time someone had tried to rush out, the valley walls had erupted with overlapping streams of bullets, like the mountains themselves were spitting fire. The patrol leader glanced at his wrist display, the digital map jittering slightly for vibrations. Their icon was a blinking blue sitting in the worst possible place. Low ground, funnel-shaped valley, ridges on either side curving inward. A textbook choke point. They were smack in the middle of it. In the corner of the display, a timer counted down in muted red, extraction window. A helicopter was supposed to be inbound, swooping in to pick them up at a landing zone beyond the far bend in the valley. But no bird was making it into this metal storm. "Try the SAT handset," the leader ordered, teeth clenched. One of the comms specialists duck-walked to the rear hatch, popping it open just enough to drag out a hard case. He snapped it open with numb fingers, pulled out the satellite handset, and thumbed the power switch. The device's small screen remained stubbornly black. He checked the plug, the battery, tried again. Nothing. He raised it toward the jagged strip of sky anyway, pressing the transmit key out of habit. Silence. No reassuring tone, no connection. "Just dead. They've got the bird too," he said, voice cracking. were blind and deaf. Another burst tore into the vehicle's top-mounted weapon station. The exposed gun, their last heavy piece of firepower, jerked once and then sagged. A soldier inside swore as pieces of the mount clanged down around his shoulders. On the valley floor, the wounded man flailed weakly, trying to drag himself back toward the others. Each movement smeared more blood into the snow. Machine gun rounds plowed up furrows around him, searching, adjusting. Somewhere up the ridge, a gunner calmly walked his fire closer to the helpless shape. "Hold your fire! Hold your fire!" the patrol leader yelled to his own troops. "Save ammo. We're not going to win a volume contest." He cast one more desperate look over the lip of the armored vehicle. All he could see were flashes in the rocks, dark shapes ducking in and out, the hint of a mortar tube up high. No clear targets, no way to break the geometry. The valley had become a slow, deliberate slaughterhouse. And then everything changed with a single, different sound. It slid through the chaos like a needle through cloth, a flat, distant crack, sharper than the stuttering roar of the machine guns, more precise than the woof of mortars. It cut across the valley half a heartbeat before the impact. On the far ridge, a figure in a dark parka had just stepped up from behind a rock with a tube on their shoulder. An RPG aimed directly at the disabled vehicle. That distant crack spoke once, and the Rocketeer snapped backward as if yanked by an invisible hook, the launcher flying from numb fingers. For a second, nobody registered what had happened. The valley kept echoing with machine gun noise. Snow kept blowing. The wounded man kept screaming. But then one of the soldiers near the back hatch shouted, "Did you see that? Did you see that? Someone dropped him." "Where?" the leader barked. "Where the hell did that come from?" No one could answer. The angle of the shot made no sense. It hadn't come from the valley floor, or from their own overwatch position they believed they had above and behind them. The tracer, there was no tracer. Just absence. One moment an enemy Rocketeer, the next a collapsing silhouette kicking up powder. The machine gun that had been chewing the valley's centerline tried to pivot toward the new threat. A spotter's head popped up from behind the rocks, scanning, hand raised to give corrections to the gunner. The distant crack came again, almost delicate. The spotter's gloved hand froze mid-gesture, then dropped bonelessly as his body folded and vanished. The gun behind him swung clumsily for a moment, its rhythm faltering. The rest of the crew shouted, confused, ducking down. "Check your IFF. Who else is out there?" The patrol leader snapped, eyes flicking to his wrist display. The tiny tactical overlay showed only their own icons, trapped in the valley. No blue force marker sat on the ridges high above. No friendly unit in range to do what was suddenly happening. "Nothing on the board," the comms man said, staring at his tablet. "I've got our overwatch, but they don't have that line. This angle isn't in the plan." Up on the ridges, the enemy felt it too. Figures shifted in their positions, some turning around instead of facing down into the valley. Panicked voices carried faintly over the wind, words in a language the patrol didn't speak but understood perfectly in tone. Who is behind us? Where is it coming from? Another shot and another. Each one crisp, intentional. A gunner reaching for his belt of ammo jerked, his hand slapping his own chest as a small dark hole appeared there. A radio operator's head snapped sideways, headset flying. The mortar tube's shadow moved as the man beside it flinched and grabbed at his shoulder, stumbling into the snow. The patrol suddenly felt the pressure ease. The walls of fire that had hemmed them in thinned, stuttered, as the enemy tried to split their attention. Half still focused on the trapped patrol, half now searching their own rear arcs, scanning rock and snow that should have been safe. The leader risked another glance over the hull. Somewhere high above, beyond naked sight, something had shifted the balance. Far up the mountain, in a place the mission folders had labeled unusable, a pair of crosshairs afloat in a circular field of glass steadied on another target. Inside the scope, everything below was flattened into geometry. Angles, distances, arcs of movement. Each breath that passed the shooter's lips fogged the edge of the eyepiece for a heartbeat before clearing. The rifle lay braced against a pack jammed into a cleft in the rock. The shooter's body was fused to the ledge, wedged beneath an overhanging cornice that looked ready to shear away with the next strong gust. Around them, the wind howled, but here in the little pocket, everything was strangely still. The shooter's face was hidden under frost-caked fabric, goggles rimed with ice. All that showed was the slow rise and fall of their shoulders and the tiny adjustments of their fingers on the trigger. Another measured exhale. Another subtle pressure. The rifle bucked once. Back down in the valley, the wounded soldier in the open lifted an arm weakly, as if trying to shield himself from the sky. The machine gun that had been tracking closer to him swung its barrel the last few degrees, walking rounds toward his chest. Bullets chewed the snow inches from his arm, throwing up plumes of powder that fell over his gear like shroud cloth. Then the weapon's barrel exploded in a spray of metal fragments and smoke, severed cleanly near the muzzle. The gunner screamed, dropping what remained as his hands recoiled, bloodied by shrapnel. The stream of fire cut off mid-burst. For a heartbeat, the valley was almost quiet. Just the wind, just the echo of that single impossible shot. Later, long after the frozen bodies had been moved and the cratered valley mapped, the official report would call it unexplained supporting fire from an unknown elevated position. The diagrams and charts would fail to account for it. The mission planning software would insist that no one could have been where those rounds had originated. At that moment, though, in that howling white bowl, no one cared about software or reports. They cared about one bruised, bleeding man still alive in the snow, and the fact that somewhere out there, hidden where no one was supposed to be, someone had decided he wasn't going to die today. 8 hours earlier, she had been just another silent figure in the back of a briefing room. The lights hummed faintly, strip bulbs casting a harsh, bluish glare over the plywood walls. Maps had been taped up wherever there was space. Contour lines, satellite images, grainy drone stills annotated with grease pencil. Outside, the world was still dark, the cold pressing against the thin metal of the forward operating base like another layer of armor. The generator's low rumble vibrated through the floor. Somewhere, a kettle whistled, and someone cursed about burned coffee. The air smelled of diesel, wet canvas, and the faint metallic tang of gun oil. The briefing officer tapped a laminated pointer against the map. "This is a routine escort," he said, which was the kind of phrase that guaranteed nothing would be routine at all. "We've got a tech team heading out to retrieve sensitive hardware from sensor site Charlie up in the mountains. We're in and out daylight before the weather rolls in." He flicked the pointer between two colored lines traced on the map. One was red, snaking along the valley floor. The other was blue, tracing a longer, more convoluted path along a series of ridges. Two options. The ridge route keeps you higher, more broken terrain, but it's longer. With the storm front moving in from the north, he jabbed at a cloud icon. "We don't want you stuck up there if visibility tanks and the bird can't find you. So we're going with the valley route. Faster, more direct, gets you to the pickup zone with a margin to spare." In the back of the room, leaning against the wall, she listened without speaking. Her rifle case stood upright beside her, glove resting on the worn handle. The fluorescent lights picked out flecks of frost still clinging to her shoulders, where she hadn't fully brushed off the outside. On the projector screen, the valley looked harmless, just a gray-white thread between darker ridges. The sat imagery flattened everything, made the world look like paper. You couldn't see the way sound would bounce in there, or how wind would carry snow, or the angles of fire. You could only see lines and dots and color-coded routes. Her call sign was stitched in subdued thread above her pocket. Rook. When she looked up at the screen, she didn't see a simple route. She saw converging walls, curved slopes, a bowl. She glanced around the room. The others were closer to the front. The platoon leader with his hands on his hips, the tech team lead, civilian jacket zipped to the chin, eyes on the small, ruggedized case on the table. The squad leaders, pointing and muttering to each other. They were engaged, arguing details. She was furniture. "Overwatch element will be here," the briefing officer continued, circling a small X on a nearby ridge. "You'll have eyes on the valley floor from this position. ready to call back any movement. He turned slightly, finally acknowledging the figure at the back. "Rook, you're running that perch. You set up, you stay put. You report. We're not playing hero up there." "Clear." A few chuckles from the front. Someone murmured, "You hear that? Sharpshooter?" No cowboy moves. She kept her expression neutral, chin dipping once. "Clear." If he noticed the tightness at the corners of her eyes, he gave no sign. On the table, next to the map, sat a folded folder with her name on it. Inside, a neat summary, top-of-class marksmanship scores, commendations from previous tours, and one black streak of ink, unauthorized repositioning during live operation, deviation from orders resulting in timeline impact. The reprimand had been written by a colonel who had never been anywhere near the dirt she'd crawled through that day. He had only seen the delayed exfil time, not the living bodies that should have been corpses. The briefing officer flipped to a new slide. The satellite image zoomed in on the intended route. Snowfields, sparse rock. Shadows. Rook's gaze drifted to the edges of the image, where resolution started to crumble and artifacts crept in. There, along a shaded slope that the route line didn't touch, she saw something. Fine tracks, not in the valley, but cutting across a higher incline. They were faint, almost washed out by the brightness, but they were there, repeated lines, too straight to be random. Near those tracks, under an overhanging bulge of rock, darker shapes stacked together. Too regular to be boulders. Too square. She pushed away from the wall. "Sir." The officer glanced over, mildly surprised she'd spoken. "Yeah." She stepped closer, flicking her gaze from the screen to the printed imagery on the table. With her gloved finger, she tapped the shaded slope. "Here." These tracks weren't on last week's imagery. And these shapes, control fixtures, maybe avalanche anchors. This slope is steeper than the resolution suggests. The officer leaned in, squinted, then shrugged. "Could be old shepherd trails. Could be snow shadows. It's not on your route. We're not going anywhere near that. It's above the route," she said. "If someone wanted to watch the valley without being seen. We're not here to redesign the terrain." He cut in, forcing a chuckle that drew a few more from the front rows. "Appreciate the attention to detail, Rook, but let's not chase ghosts on every image artifact. We got a timeline. Ridge route is too slow with the storm. Valley route, overwatch from your assigned point, tech team in and out. That's the play." She let the argument die in her throat. "Roger." A tech specialist stepped forward, lifting the small, ruggedized case from the table. It looked unremarkable, rough plastic, reinforced corners, biometric latch. He held it with the kind of care usually reserved for newborns or explosives. "This is our precious cargo," he said. "We had to abandon Sensor Site Charlie during the last push. This unit stayed behind. It's part of an encryption and sensor suite. If it gets reverse engineered, our advantage shrinks. If someone films themselves opening it on the internet, we've got a problem in a different war. So that's what's worth all this effort," she thought. A box with secrets. The platoon leader took the case, weighing it. "We'll get your toy back," he said. "We'll be home in time for lunch." Laughter again. Easy. Confident. Outside, the first fingers of dawn were starting to sketch pale light across the snowfields. The storm front on the weather map looked small and distant behind the glass, not yet the wall it would become. As the briefing broke up, gear rustled, boots thudded, chairs scraped. People fell into familiar pairs and clusters, trading remarks, jibes, last-minute questions. Rook picked up her rifle case and slipped out with hardly a shoulder brushed. In the motor pool, armored vehicles sat in a row like crouched beasts, exhaust plumes already rising. Snowmobiles were lined up beside them, sleds hitched, tarps flapping. She climbed into the small snowcat that would take her to the Overwatch drop-off point. Frost crawled along the inside of the windshield, the heater battling with the cold. The driver grinned around a thermos lid. "You get the good seat," he said. "Nice view, no walking." She just nodded and settled in, setting her rifle across her knees. As the snowcat growled to life and rolled out of the wire, she lifted her spotting scope and scanned ahead. The valley lay in shadow, its floor smooth and unbroken from this distance. But on the slopes above, she saw it again, faint, crisp tracks where none should be, cutting across wind-blown drifts. And at one edge, a brief, unnatural glint where the sun caught something too sharp and bright to be rock. She keyed her mic. "Frost 1, Rook. How about fresh sign on the high slopes above your plan route? Looks like movement over the last 24, maybe less." "Copy, Rook." The platoon leader's voice came back, cheerful, unbothered. "Log it and move on. Storm clock's ticking. We'll be out of the valley before anyone can decide if they want to be trouble." She watched the patrol's icons move across her wrist display. Armored vehicle, snowmobiles, dismounts. The leader's marker pulsed at the front. "You got it," she said quietly, and thumbed her mic off. The snowcat labored up a narrow side trail, tracks churning, engine whining. They climbed until the valley floor fell away, the convoy below shrinking to toy models crawling along a white thread. The driver dropped her short of the planned overwatch point when the terrain grew too steep. "This is as far as I go," he said. "You walk the rest." She stepped down into snow that swallowed her calves, the cold biting even through thick fabric. The wind pushed at her chest, trying to turn her back. She hoisted her pack, slung the rifle, and started up the last slope. The assigned perch was a sensible spot, broad, stable, good view of the valley's entrance and first turn. She reached it, dropped her gear, and set up, bipod extended, scope checked, rangefinder calibrated. She took a slow scan. From here, she could see the patrol's start point and the first leg of their movement. She could cover the approach, call out anything that tried to hit them early. But her gaze drifted higher, to a jagged ridge further along. It sat stacked above the valley, offset so that its line of sight would cut across both walls and into the deeper curve where the route dipped. The slope beneath it was a mess of broken snow and rock, steeper than comfortable, undercut by old slides. That ridge was labeled inaccessible in the mission folders. Too exposed, too unstable, no easy route up. Rook raised her binoculars and traced the faint tracks she'd seen in the imagery. They wound just below that ridge, connecting a series of rusted, half-buried structures she now recognized. Avalanche control fixtures, steel cables anchored into concrete blocks under the snow. Someone had been there recently. Someone who knew the terrain better than the planning software did. She felt a knot form low in her stomach. She lay behind her rifle and forced herself to breathe, to focus on the valley entrance, on the patrol as it moved. That other ridge sat in the corner of her vision, a nagging presence. Below, the armored vehicle and snowmobiles slid into the shadowed throat of the valley. The patrol leader cracked jokes over the net about getting back for hot food. Laughs answered him. On her screen, their icons crawled forward, blinking patiently. She logged the glint on the far ridge. She logged the tracks. She logged the label inaccessible. And she waited, eyes split between where she was told to look and where she suspected she should. In a few hours, when the valley turned into a kill box, she would remember every line on that map, every shape she'd seen and been told to ignore. And when the first mortar round hit and the radios turned to static, she would stop waiting. The kill zone did not announce itself. It began with a sound like someone sighing across the net. A faint hiss that slid over the squad radios, soft at first, then swelling. Voices on the channel grew distant, warbling, before dissolving into a wall of static. "Net check," the patrol leader said. "Rook, say again your last." Rook keyed her mic. "Frost 1. Your valley walls are too quiet." No animal sign, no. Her own voice vanished into her ears, eaten by white noise. She glanced at her radio, then at the secondary. Both showed connection. Neither carried anything but hiss. Behind the static, she thought she could hear a faint, high-pitched whine, like someone scraping metal on glass. Full-spectrum jamming. Down in the valley, the armored vehicle rounded a bend. The world tightened around them as the valley narrowed, ridges drawing closer. Snow rose higher on the sides, ridgelines leaning in. What had been a broad valley became a funnel. Rook watched through her scope as the lead scout glanced up nervously at the slopes. She saw his mouth move, saw the tiny shrug he gave when whatever he said didn't draw any audible reply. Deep in the valley, someone noticed how quiet it was. No far-off sound of shepherd dogs barking, no distant engines, no echo of other life. Just their own machines, their own breath, their own boots crunching in the snow. The buried charge went off under the lead track with a dirty, heavy thump that Rook felt through the rock under her chest. The armored vehicle jolted upward, its front end popping into the air, treads spinning. It slammed back down at an angle, one track half off, nose skewing sideways. Snow and dirt geysered up around it, mixed with metal fragments. Before the plume had settled, the valley walls erupted. From the left, from the right, from high above, machine guns roared. Rook saw the first spray of tracers streak across the valley, crisscrossing in overlapping fields. She watched them walk across the road, forcing dismounts to dive prone, then bite into the flank of the crippled vehicle. She grabbed her radio again, shouted into it. Ambush. Frost 1, break contact. Reverse. Get out of that. Static. She swung her rifle, tried to pick out targets. But from her assigned perch, her angle was too low, her line of sight too shallow. The enemy had dug in higher than she could cover, in scooped-out nests that looked like nothing from satellite height, and everything from a more honest perspective. A mortar round dropped into view above the valley, trailing snow dust. It landed out of her sight behind an outcrop, but she saw the shockwave flare against the ridgeline, saw a chunk of snow peel away and tumble. On her display, icons stuttered. One turned amber, then red. She watched as a scout went down, leg torn open, rolling in the road. Someone tried to drag him toward the armored vehicle, only to be forced back by a spray of rounds that stitched the ground at their heels. The valley had become exactly what her gut had told her it was, a carefully crafted kill zone. She pressed her cheek harder into the stock, teeth bared. She could call out machine gun flashes, try to give rough adjustments, but with the radios smothered, her voice might as well have been the wind. She shifted, trying to find another angle. As she crawled along her little perch, a gust hit the slope below, whipping the top layer of snow into the air. A fine mist of powder swept across the valley, turning everything into a gray blur. Figures turned into smudges, muzzle flashes into ghosts behind a curtain. Down below, the patrol's small quadcopter buzzed upward, a last-ditch eye in the sky. It rose above the valley floor, camera turning toward the slopes. There was a single flash from high up, sharper than the others. The drone jerked, spun, and then tumbled end over end, vanishing into the snow like a dead insect. They have their own Overwatch, she thought, and they know exactly what to kill first. She tracked the rough arc of the shot in her mind. It hadn't come from the positions currently chewing up the valley. It had come from somewhere above them all. Higher. Offset. Her gaze slid, almost against her will, to that other ridge. The one she'd been told was inaccessible. The one with the faint tracks and the rusted cables. Her stomach knotted again, this time with anger. Stay put and report, the briefing had said. Don't play hero up there. From where she lay now, obeying meant watching an entire patrol die in a trap she had half seen forming and been ordered not to chase. She stared at the icons on her display, at the red ones blinking, at the ones that had vanished. She watched another mortar round land closer, watched the patrol curl into itself behind the armored hull. Her fingers tightened on the rifle. Then she slid back from her position and slung the weapon. The slope toward the inaccessible ridge dropped away in a shallow gully, the snow crusted and treacherous. She moved into it, boots punching through, using the gully's walls to hide her from the valley and, for the moment, from the enemy ridgeline. Each step broke the surface and sank, the snow squeaking and crunching. Wind shoved at her back, threatening to overbalance her. Loose chunks rolled past her ankles, picking up more snow as they went. She moved fast enough to make progress, but slow enough not to trigger the slope. Every avalanche she'd ever seen, every training video of Slab letting go, lived in the back of her mind as she picked her route. The faint tracks she'd seen from above resolved into something more concrete. Boot prints, pressed deep and fresh. They followed the line of rusted steel cables half buried in the snow, anchored to concrete blocks barely visible under the ice. Man-made bones of old avalanche control systems, forgotten by planners, rediscovered by locals or enemies. She reached one of the anchors and brushed snow away. The cable thrummed faintly under her gloves, vibrating with the wind. It continued across a near-vertical face, disappearing behind a bulge of ice. "Inaccessible," she murmured, breath fogging her scarf. She pulled a sling and carabiner from her packet of climbing aids, clipped into the cable, and eased out along the exposed section. The drop below was a long way of falling and sliding and breaking. Her boots sought tiny ledges in the rock, edges in the hard snow. Above her, a distant mortar blast rattled the air. The vibration ran through the cable into her arms. A slab of snow further along cracked and slid in a miniature avalanche, pouring down in a frothy river that roared past her, missing her boots by a meter. If that had gone full depth, she thought, it would have taken her and the patrol on the valley floor, too. The mountain did not care which side she was on. As she moved, fragments of a different day flickered at the edge of her vision. A village burned under a hot sun, the air thick with smoke and the smell of char. A narrow alley choked with rubble. Children crying behind a broken wall. Orders crackling over the radio to hold position, to maintain the cordon, to let the airstrike finish the job. She'd ignored those orders, slipped through the cordon, dragged 3 people out of a collapsing courtyard as the last aircraft rolled in. The explosion had been bigger than predicted. Debris had rained down. The timeline had slipped. The colonel had been embarrassed in front of his peers. The reprimand had been written in cold, crisp language. The civilians had not been mentioned. Her hands shook, not from the memory, but from the strain of holding herself against the rock. She forced her focus back to the present. The cable. The next step. The valley. Her laser rangefinder, slung at her hip, beeped a warning and flickered. She glanced at its tiny screen. The numbers jittered, then went black. Cold had drained the battery faster than expected. Or maybe the vibration had cracked something inside. Either way, she had lost her easy distances. "Fine," she said under her breath. "Old school it is." She reached the end of the worst of the traverse and pulled herself onto a narrow ledge beneath an overhanging cornice. The wind largely bypassed this pocket, creating a strange, insulated stillness. Her lungs burned, drawing in thin, freezing air. Her thighs trembled. There was just enough space to wedge herself sideways. Pack jammed between her and the rock, rifle laid across it. It wasn't a proper prone position, but it was something she could shoot from without falling. She settled her cheek against the stock and opened the scope. The world below reshaped. The valley floor lay far beneath, deeper and more curved than the satellite imagery had ever suggested. From here, she could see the entire kill box, the twisted, armored vehicle, the scattered bodies, the movement behind the hull. She could also see the enemy in a way she hadn't before. The machine gun nests weren't just flashes now. They were full shapes, men behind shields of rock and snow, ammo cans at their knees. The mortar pit was a shallow scrape behind a crest, with 2 men feeding rounds and 1 man, standing slightly apart, holding a radio and a laminated range card. And there, in a shallow cave she hadn't been able to detect from her previous angle, lay the enemy sniper. His rifle extended just beyond the lip of the cave, barrel resting on a small tripod. His body was half in shadow, legs braced, scope aligned on the valley. She watched him adjust his focus, calm, methodical. He was the one who had dropped their drone. He was the one who would pick off anyone who tried to break from cover. He never once looked up and back. Over her shoulder, the jamming still hummed. But under the static, she caught a different set of voices now. On a secondary frequency, weakly bleeding through, she heard clipped commands in another language. She'd learned enough to recognize a few key words. The box. The officer. Recording. Her jaw tightened. So it wasn't just about killing a patrol for territory or harassment. They wanted the tech case and at least 1 ranking soldier alive. They wanted to film something, break a narrative, claim a trophy. She checked her magazine. Limited. Enough for a controlled engagement. Not enough for a drawn-out slugging match. No spare rifle up here. No partner to feed her targets. Every shot would have to be chosen with care. From this perch, unreachable by design, she had something no one else did: the whole pattern. The arcs of fire, the locations of the brains behind the trigger fingers. The seams. She steadied her breathing. The cold stung at the corners of her eyes. Her scope glass held a tiny flaw on one edge, a reminder of an earlier bump, but the center was clear. She placed the crosshairs on the enemy sniper's cheek, just in front of the ear. At that angle, the bullet would travel through bone and brain, minimizing overpenetration. She thought of orders, of reprimands, of a colonel's crossed arms, of 3 children who had lived long enough to see another sunrise. Once she opened this fight, the clock would start in a different way. For the patrol, for the enemy, for herself. There would be no going back to that safe, assigned perch. No pretending she hadn't seen the lines on the map. "Okay," she whispered, hardly moving her lips. "Let's play." She exhaled, let the breath go all the way out, and pressed the trigger. Up here, the rifle's recoil was a firm shove into her shoulder, then gone. The shot's crack was sharp, but muffled under the cornice. Down in the valley, one more piece of the invisible pattern shifted. And for a patrol pinned behind a crippled vehicle, in a world of white and fire, salvation began to come from a place no one had thought to watch. Hours later, when the extraction bird finally clawed its way back into the sky and the valley lay scarred and smoking behind them, she remained on that ridge, rifle empty, scope cracked, alone in the wind. The enemy rounds still reached for her, tracing lines through sky that no longer mattered. Her work, the shots that had turned a massacre into an escape, would be reduced to a sentence in a report. Unanticipated overwatch from elevated position contributed to mission survival. The enemy plans, patient tracking of patrol patterns, the careful placement of avalanche cables into their own map of the terrain, the intended capture of hardware and prisoners for a triumphant broadcast, would be detailed in intelligence annexes that almost no one would read. The wounded soldier in the snow would remember something else. The feel of bullets sewing the ground around his fingers, the taste of blood and ice, and the way the machine gun's roar had stopped at the exact moment he'd thought about letting go. The way, later, when pain blurred everything, he looked up at the high ridge and seen nothing but ice and rock and blowing snow. And the quiet woman with the rifle, who trudged into the casualty collection point hours after everyone else, frost hanging from her lashes, would shrug off the nods and thanks and go back to the map board, to circle a place labeled inaccessible and write 2 small words beside it in pencil. Someone was here. Days later, when another patrol rolled out and another briefing showed another image with a blind spot that made her skin crawl, she would once again drift toward the edges of the room, toward the places no one else stood. And when the route was drawn and the obvious overwatch points marked, she would mark something else in her own head. Because some habits, once earned in snow and blood, never leave. She knew, with a certainty that lived in her bones, that the safest ground was almost never the ground everyone agreed on. So when the wind screamed over the next ridge and the world went white again, she was not where the plans said she'd be. She was where no one watched, at the angle no software believed was usable, eyes steady behind a battered scope. Out there, between protocol and improvisation, between fear and function, that's where people either died or didn't. That's where she had decided, long ago, she belonged. The places no one watched were the ones she chose. Because that was where they would need her most.